There's no time to rest when your foe doesn't sleep. System Shock by Origin successfully weaves adventure and action to create a novel science fiction challenge. Marvel at the first-person, 3D, smooth-scrolling viewpoint as you jump, lean around corners, look up and down, crawl, and even fly in rocket boots.
System Shock, released in 1994 by Nightdive Studios, is a fascinating relic for its time. And while even with some quality of life improvements were added a few years ago in the Enhanced Edition, it's still a bit awkward to play, and hence why we're seeing a remake at some point soon. That said, if you're willing to give some time to get adjusted to the controls and the learning curve around the interface, you'll find a very rewarding experience that in many ways surpasses the sequel, System Shock 2. While it's a bit of a cliche to say so, System Shock was way ahead of its time, and its DNA has been felt in many games since. How did System Shock come together? After feeling some burnout after being sucked into Ultima Underworld 1 and 2 the last few years, programmer Doug Church decided their next game was going to be sci-fi, and the team came up with a handful of high-level designs with Warren Spector, Paul Neurath, and Austin Grossman. The team did find that the conversation stuff was a bit of a pain and a distraction, and stats were also a bit of a distraction, so they decided to streamline a bit. Can't we make it a little more action and a little more immediate? There you go, folks, they dumbed it down. Although the context back then is a lot different than how it would be now. And with some utter programming wizardry like they had done with Ultima Underworld, out emerged System Shock. Let's talk about the main hurdle that comes with playing System Shock in this day and age, and that's the controls, and they're awkward. Now, you have to remember, this was uncharted territory at the time. This is well before best practices started to emerge with this kind of game. So it's not really a knock on the team, since this was still uncharted territory at the time. Even with the Enhanced Edition, it's still quite awkward. It's more in the style of how Arx Fatalis plays. In the previous video I did on the System Shock remake demo, which you could find here, I mentioned that it feels akin to learning something like Vim or Emacs. Some mad lad invested this system that didn't exactly take user experience into mind, and it does take some time to adjust to. It wasn't until several levels in I felt like I had a good grasp of the controls, and even then, it still was a bit awkward. Oh, and of course there's the UI that feels like it takes cues from the old Microsoft Word where everything was just stuffed in the front. It's an utter mess. And yet, it does add some charm to the game. And I think this dated setup, especially compared to System Shock 2, which, while it had its issues, is much more in line with modern first-person games, and why this game is a great candidate for a remake. Even in the Enhanced Edition, they could have just taken the game as is and make it control like a standard first-person game. This game is built around the way it controls, and it would take away a lot from the pacing and the difficulty associated with it. System Shock is one of the first major games, if not the first, to make use of the audiolog approach for storytelling. What's interesting is the reason this approach arose was due to a design choice to get around constraints of the technology of the time. The reasons we wanted all the audio for the voiceovers was because the whole idea of killing everyone on the station, and then making all the people only accessible through their data logs, was that you could keep playing the game. You wouldn't have to stop to have a conversation, or stop to read, or choose to stop. You'd just be moving around, and if you want to, you could listen to a log from the person there, and they'd be describing a scene that happened in the very room you were in. In the original release of System Shock, which was on a number of floppy disks, they did not have voice acting, so you would actually have to sit down and read these. The team did regret having to release this version. The team felt that the dialogue system in Ultima Underworld was a bit jarring and took people out of the game, so in a way, this design decision due to constraints led to a type of storytelling technique in games that have been widely used since. Not only games taken from the Looking Glass mold, but well beyond it. And unlike other games that would make use of the audio logs that would come out later on, where you're wondering why the hell someone is recording these things and leaving them around, BioShock Infinite, they make sense in the context of the game here. The voice acting is passable and has an amateurish charm about it, as most of the voice acting was done by the team or friends of the team.
SHODAN security is closing down on us. The elevators are frozen. Myra keeps saying that it's the cameras and the medical CPU core that SHODAN's using these to hold onto the level.
But there's one voice that stands out in particular, but we'll get to that in a bit. Let's focus on the sound for a bit here. While a little outdated with the MIDI sound fronts, the tracks are well composed and very memorable. You could try different sound fronts with the game, although for my playthrough and the music I'm using here, I went with how it sounds by default. The music was composed by Greg Piccolo, bassist of the alternative rock band Tribe based out of Boston. He was contracted by Looking Glass, and after Tribe disbanded in 1994, he went in the next day and asked for a full-time role as an audio and music developer, and he was given the job right away. There's a lot of nice varieties here when it comes to the music. While System Shock 2 had the upbeat techno feel with the ambient tracks mixed in, here it's more of a rock and industrial feel, with some more haunting tracks mixed in for ambience. Plus, there's the one track that sounds like Head Like a Hole by 9 Inch Nails. Oh, and you can't talk about the music without, of course, mentioning the classic elevator music. While the sound of the weapons can be a bit thin and lack some kick, they're still distinct and memorable, and more due to the technology limits at the time. Enemies have very distinct cues, especially the Your Memo robot. And wait a minute. What was that sound? Wait a minute, that's Bowser in Mario Kart 64. Guess it turns out it was a stock sound. With all this talk about the enemies, let's get more into the game design. While looking at the map makes these levels look like utter mazes, they're a lot more straightforward, intuitive, and well designed on first glance. We'll also be opening up shortcuts to loop back to other parts of the level, and we'll be revisiting levels as the game goes on to complete further objectives in a way that's, dare I say it, Metroidvania-ish in design. One noticeable difference between System Shock 1 and System Shock 2 is that while System Shock 2 has a noticeable drop in quality for the last quarter or so of the game, there's none of that quality drop off in System Shock. Each level has enough variety, is well thought out, and doesn't have the feeling that the game needs to be rushed out to meet a deadline when it comes to the last quarter. There's a really nice, tense gameplay loop in System Shock that I really enjoy when we arrive on a new level. Each level, save for the last couple, have restoration bays. First, we have to find them and turn off the cyborg conversion process on them. Once we do, if we are killed, we return to the restoration bay. But what happens if you die before you change them? So when entering a new level, especially earlier in the game, when we don't have a ton of weapons, it's best to take your time and play cautious before finding that restoration bay on that level. Well, once we do, however, it's fun to get a bit more sloppy and running into rooms with reckless abandon, and some of the larger areas it'd be easier just to die as a result if needing to go somewhere that's further away. Unlike System Shock 2, in which some weapons were locked from us due to us not having enough status points, there are none of these RPG elements in System Shock, so any weapon we find, we can make use of. There are some issues I found with some of the weapons, especially later on, where it felt like there was a lot of overlap and became redundant in what these weapons could do. And of course, I have to mention the comically overpowered laser rapier. This became my weapon of choice in System Shock, and it didn't get old to activate the restoration bays and then run into rooms bashing enemies like an absolute mad lad and watching foes die with the greatest of ease. Now let's look into one gameplay section of the game that was removed from the sequel, and one that was recently revealed of how it would play out in the System Shock remake. That, of course, is the cyberspace portions. At various areas in the game, we could enter cyberspace. It's an interesting idea, and the music is fantastic. But it feels a bit tacked on, to which the team would agree. Programmer Doug Church would have the following to say on it. We thought it would just fit from a conceptual standpoint. You're a hacker. Shouldn't you hack something? We thought it'd be fun to throw in different movement modes that were more freeform, more action. In retrospect, we probably should have either cut it or spent more time on it. There is some fun stuff in it, but it's not as polished as it should be. But even so, it was nice because it at least reinforced the idea that you were the hacker in a totally random, arcadey, broken sort of way. 100% I agree with this, and recently we saw with the upcoming System Shock remake how it's going to look. Here's what it looks like. And System Shock 2, on the other hand, completely removes cyberspace altogether. And the last boss of the game in System Shock takes place in cyberspace. Man, I was swearing under my breath trying to get to her. But now is a good time to talk about SHODAN, isn't it?
Around me is a burgeoning empire of steel. From my throne room, lines of power careen into the skies of Earth.
SHODAN is one of the most iconic villains in gaming, and to me, probably my favorite case of an evil AI. The iconic voice of SHODAN, courtesy of Terry Brosius, one of the bandmates of composer Greg Low-Piccolo of the band Tribes, who was working on the music at the time for System Shock. The voice of SHODAN was heavily inspired by Max Headroom.
Idiot. I will shortly complete the process of downloading my magnificent
There's a noticeable difference in the role between SHODAN in this System Shock versus her role in System Shock 2, which is now a good warning for some spoilers for System Shock 2, but at this point you've probably played it, but I also have a video on it you could go check out. But from the very beginning of the game, we know that SHODAN is out to get us. Compare that to System Shock 2, where we're duped by her for a good portion of the early game, only for her to reveal who she actually is, and in a way, we have an uneasy alliance with her, and then deal with her at the end. Both have their merits, but I'm still going to have to give the edge out to the sequel, and nothing quite hits like that scene in the sequel where she reveals herself to the player. This is something I've done in the past with other Looking Glass Studio titles, looking at Thief 1 versus Thief 2, which you can find here. So let's compare System Shock 1 and System Shock 2. Now, to be fair, the difference in Thief 1 and Thief 2 was a little over a year, and was much more of an incremental improvement as compared to System Shock 1 versus System Shock 2, which is 5 years, and how much the industry changed in that time from 1994 to 1999, from graphics to UI to best practices, is staggering. So it's a bit harder to judge a difference between the two. When it comes to level design, I give System Shock 1 the upper hand. But as well, the game remains at a consistent quality throughout, where System Shock 2 takes a noticeable dive in quality for the last quarter or so of the game. There's much more backtracking in System Shock, but it doesn't feel like padding, whereas in System Shock 2, where some of the bits of backtracking felt a lot more like padding. When it comes to the gameplay, System Shock 2 has the edge, not just due to the more friendly controls and UI, but also having a wider variety of choices at our disposal, and I prefer to have the RPG elements in the game as well. That said, it is nice in System Shock to not have to worry about stats with each weapon we can get. Any weapon we find, we can make use of. I prefer the overall variety of enemies in System Shock, and I'm curious if the game was made a few years later, how it would have made use of voices for them like System Shock 2 did with the many. While the music sounds less dated in System Shock 2 due to the sound fronts, I prefer the overall compositions and more industrial feel of System Shock compared to the techno beats of System Shock 2. So overall, I think I have to give the slight edge to System Shock 2, but it's a bit more difficult to compare these than say Thief 1 or Thief 2, again due to how much changed in gaming from 1994 to 1999. That said, there's still a number of ways where I feel System Shock is a superior game. RPG Codex, the site that, according to their Twitter, makes Brian Fargo shiver, had a thread a few years ago of a poll of which game was better, and System Shock 2 beat it out by 1 vote. And after comparing the two, let's look more into the future of System Shock. So, my Taffers one and all, how does the future of System Shock look? Well, let's first start with the remake of System Shock. As mentioned earlier, I did do a video on the System Shock remake demo a few months back, and having beat System Shock, I went back to the demo again. While the game has had a rocky development, which you could see in the excellent no-clip documentary, It is extremely promising and looks to update the original for a more modern design without losing the spirit of the original. And while there are changes, in particular the atmosphere that feels more akin to something like Dead Space, going for much more of an ambient soundtrack from what I understand, I've been impressed with what's been shown so far, and many people seem to agree. As well, the recent unveiling of how Cyberspace would look is very promising, and looks to have been taken by the team at Nightdive Studios as a half-cooked idea and fleshing it out. So hopefully we'll see it soonish? It's really hard to say when it'll be out, but certainly looks promising. Oh, and System Shock 3, well, oh boy, hey, what is there to say about this one? It's not really clear if Tencent is taking over the development or publishing it or what the hell is going on with it. The wording was very vague. I have extremely low expectations for this one, and it may sound cynical, you should as well. Trust me, life is better that way. I'm not sure if I would say this is a bigger shit show than Vampire Bloodlines 2, but for both my Taffer friends, let's have some low expectations.
How does it feel to have lived long enough to see all of your favorite franchises go down in flames?
Feels great.
Anyways, my Taffers, that is my video on System Shock. I hope you enjoyed it. Give it a whirl if you haven't, or again, maybe wait till the remake comes out. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe, leave a like, comment how you feel, which one you like better, System Shock 1 or 2, join my Discord, there's all going to be links below of additional sources that you could read. Boulder Punch out.